welcome in. Are you here to learn how to play chess? You are. Okay, great. Well, go ahead and have a seat, and we can go ahead and get started. Now, are you completely new to chess? Do you know a little bit of background? Not really anything? Okay. Well, before we get into the rules and how to play, I guess I'll just give you some quick background on the game itself. So, to me, the game is a very beautifully and brilliantly made game. It has gained international recognition, and there have been many matches played between various countries and various players. Many brilliant minds have played the game and made a living off of it, which is pretty incredible considering chess is really just a board with 64 squares and 32 pieces, 16 for each team. So, the other great part about chess is you can play it really anywhere as long as you have a board and pieces. You can play in the park with your friend. You can play in a library. You can play just anywhere. You can play on a computer against a computer. And so it's very accessible, and it's been made popular by various figures throughout history. And nowadays there have been movies made from it, countless books written about it, about its players, about the strategy behind the game. And now there's even a show out that has made it quite popular called The Queen's Gambit, which I highly recommend watching. So, that's just some background, and again, it's nice to have your interest. So let's go ahead and take the pieces out and set up the board, and I'll kind of give you the background on how to set up the pieces and play the game. So, as I mentioned before, there are 32 pieces, 16 pieces on each side of the board. So, I will go ahead and take the pieces out and introduce them to you one at a time, giving you some knowledge on how they work, where they can move, and we can get right into it. So, what I'll do is take the pieces out one at a time and kind of go through the hierarchy of pieces to give you an idea of which pieces have the most power, which pieces don't, and strategically how to use them. So, let's go ahead and do that. Okay. So if you're just starting out, the first thing to know is that this is a pawn. And the pawn holds the least amount of power in the game of chess. However, if you use them correctly and strategically, you can set up some really good, powerful defenses with the pawn. Now, there are a lot of pawns, relatively speaking, for each side. So, each side has 16 pieces, 8 of them are pawns, and they all start in the second row of the board. So, I'll go ahead and set them up now. that's one side. Okay, so we have all the pawns set up now, and as I mentioned earlier, all of the pawns go on the second row of the board for each team when you're starting the game. So the first thing to know about pawns is when you're starting the game, they can move either 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. So it's up to you whether you want to move 1 or 2 squares forward. However, after they make that first move, they can only move 1 square forward at a time. They can't move backwards and they can't move horizontally. They can only move forward. Now, the exception to that rule is if a piece from the opposing team is diagonal 1 square from the pawn. The pawn has the power to take that piece and take its spot. So that is the only time a pawn can move diagonally. Now, because of that power that it has to take pieces if they are 1 space diagonally from the pawn, pawns can be very powerful in a pyramid type pattern. And so, if you have your pawns set up in such a way that they form this kind of triangular pyramid type pattern, opposing pieces will have a very tricky time navigating around these pawns. And because there's so many of them, it can be, a good defense to protect your other pieces and ultimately your king. So that's just a bit of insight for the pawns. Oh, and one other thing. Now, this very rarely happens, but if your pawn happens to make it to the very last row of the board, you can turn it into any piece that you'd like. And we'll get into what power the other pieces hold, but most times you'll turn it into a queen. So we will get into the other pieces now and set them up. So the next most powerful piece is one of 2 pieces, and you could debate which one holds more power, but in my personal opinion, they both are very equal and have the same amount of power. And they are the knights and the bishops. So we'll start with the knights first. So the knight looks like a horse, and some people might even call it a horse, but technically it's called a knight. And the knight is a very unique piece in the game because it can move in L shapes. Now this means it can jump over pieces. It's the only piece in chess that can do that. No other piece can jump over another piece. So knights start in the back on the second square of each side. And so for your first move of the game, if you wanted to, you could move your knight out in front of your pawns, because it can make that a leap. Those are the power of the knights, and certain advantages can occur when your knight has the power to move in L's. For example, if your opponent has two valuable pieces on one space the knight can move to and another space the knight can move to, then your opponent's in a very tricky position, because during their turn they can only move one of those pieces, and so your knight can then take the other piece that is left in its way. So that is just something to think about as you navigate your knights throughout the board. Now, the next piece is the bishop, and as I mentioned, I believe they hold the same amount of power as a knight, but they just move very differently. So we'll set those up now. Okay, so this is what the bishop looks like, and again, it could vary between different chess sets, but typically it's a very tall looking piece. So bishops start out between the two knights. So you can see here are the knights and here are the bishops. The bishops are unique in that they can move diagonally as far across the board as they'd like. There is no limit to how far they can go in their diagonal nature. So when you have a bishop that is, let's say, here, you have to really watch out for them if you're the other team, because the bishop can hang out kind of on the side of the board, but it can still protect a wide span of squares that it can move diagonally on. Now, each bishop starts off on the two opposing colors on each side for the squares. So you have one bishop that is on the white square, you have one bishop that's on the black square. And because they can only move diagonally, they will always remain on their colored square. So the white bishop will always be on the white squares, and then the bishop on the black squares will always remain on the black squares. Now you might be wondering, how does the knight and the bishop have the same amount of power when they're so different? You will see as we continue with looking at each piece that they have very limited power compared to the other pieces. And so when you really compare all the pieces at once together, you kind of just notice that the bishop and the knight have the same power, even though very different roles. Okay, so let's take out the next most powerful piece, which is the rook, or the castle. So the castles all start on the four corners of the board. So we'll set them up now. Okay, so castles are powerful in that they can move as far as they want vertically and horizontally. Um, and the trickiest part with moving your castles is getting them out of their corner, because it can be a bit tricky getting them past the pawns, because unlike the knight, they cannot jump. So another, I guess, rule of chess is you cannot take the spot of another piece, or jump over them like in checkers, unless you're the knight. So the tricky part with castles is getting them in the game. But once they're in the game, or they're always in the game, but once they're more involved on the board, they do hold quite a bit of power. Alright, so we're going to take a detour of the hierarchy of power that we've been climbing here, because the next piece I'm going to show you is not the most powerful piece in the game, but it is a very central piece to the game, because when you lose this piece, you lose the game, and that is the king. Now, when it comes to mobility and power, the king is actually very weak. He can only move one square in any direction, backwards, forwards, left, right, diagonal. And he can still take pieces, but you should never rely on him being an offensive player. The king is meant to be protected, so that's where you can use your pawns and your other pieces to protect your king. Now, when you hear the terms check or checkmate, those mean your king is in danger. So the term check means that the player has moved a piece in a way that in the next move it could take the king, and therefore you would lose the game. But if you just say check, that means there is some move that can be done to save the king. Sometimes that means moving the king itself. Other times that means using another piece to get in the way and protect the king. But anytime you hear check, that just means the king is in danger and you are now on the defense to save your king. Now, the term checkmate, as you probably know, means the game is over, because the opposing player has moved their piece in such a way that the king cannot avoid being taken. And so it's really important when you are that player saying checkmate to really make sure it is checkmate. Sometimes you might not see a move that the other player can do to save their king, but most times it is the phrase that ends the game. So with that, let's look at my personal favorite piece of the game, and also the most powerful piece in the game. Go figure. So that would be the queen. Alright, so the queen always begins on her color of the board. So as you can see, there is a white space next to the king here, and because this is the white king, she starts on that white middle space. On the other side here, there's the black queen, and she starts on the black middle square of the board. So the queen is the most powerful player in the game because she can move as many spaces as she wants, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. So she essentially has all of the mobility of the castle and the bishop. And so you really want to use your queen in a way that threatens the other player, but it's tricky because you don't want to lose your queen to the other side. When you take someone else's queen, that really puts them at a disadvantage because they lose a lot of power losing their queen. So with that, we have the entire board set up here, and one other rule I'll point out is castling. So if you've heard of this before, it refers to the king and the castle doing a little move together that you can only do one time in the game. Now it has to meet a certain criteria for it to work, so I'll show you that now. So the first criteria is there can be no pieces between the castle and the king. So hypothetically, if your knight and bishop were in the middle of the board, you could now castle with your king and your castle. So what castling means is the king moves over 2 spaces and the castle essentially goes to the other side of the king. And this is highly advantageous for 2 reasons. One, because it gets your castle out of that corner and more in line to be in the game. And it also puts your king more towards the corner and protected by the pawns here. So it's good offensively and defensively. Now another criteria for castling is your king must not have been put in check for the entire game or before you castle. If your king has been put in check before you castle, then you can no longer castle. So that is another rule, and it can be done on both sides of the board. So for example, this I would call short castling because your king is only 2 squares away from the castle here, or 3 depending on how you look at it. Now if we wanted to long castle, it would be this way. And so it's still the same move, just the castle moves 3 spaces instead of 2. So your king still moves 2 spaces. That is always true. But in this case, your castle moves to the other side of the king, which is then 3 spaces over. So that's just something to keep in mind as you play. And there are all kinds of strategies on when to castle, when not to castle, and it can be a very useful move, especially when you don't have any good moves in front of you. It could be good just to use that as kind of a filler move and then see what happens for the rest of the game. Okay, so that is how you set up the board, and we could talk for a very long time about various strategies. The Queen's Gambit is itself a strategy, but before we go, I guess I'll just give you one little tip on how to start the game. Now, there are various strategies on starting the game, the middle of the game, and the end of the game. So you kind of have to break it up in those pieces. But this is a strategy for the beginning of the game, and that is to control the middle 4 pieces of the board. So you can do that in a variety of ways. The most common would be moving your pawns, your middle pawns out, so they control the middle 4 pieces, or using your knights, which if you move them out just once, they already control 2 squares, or they're protecting two middle squares there of the board. Now the reason it's important and smart to do that is because when you're controlling the middle of the board, you're really controlling a lot of the rest of the board, because Now your pieces can kind of branch out from that middle section and threaten the other team in various ways. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial on the power of the pieces and what they can do, how to play, and how to set up the board. And it's been very nice teaching you and giving you some tips and tricks on how to play chess. So once again, thank you for your interest. It's been a pleasure teaching you, and I hope you come back to learn more, and perhaps we can play a match. All right. Well, thank you, and have a great day. Bye now.